So my presentation this morning was really about tackling the problem of scale-up for engineering companies in the UK and more broadly. In order to address the question of scale-up, we need to define what a scale-up actually is. And the first thing I talked about in my presentation this morning was trying to understand the journey that companies go on when they're trying to grow. And that journey consists of three chasms, three hurdles that have to be crossed. Chasm one is when you convert a concept to a prototype, and we're very good at that in the UK. The third chasm is one where you try and scale the business in terms of signing up more customers, driving revenues. And that usually happens much more easily once you've crossed chasm two. So in my talk today, I was describing how chasm two is the really big challenge. And chasm two is the big challenge, A, because people don't understand that it's there. So it's been previously described in vague terms such as value or death and complexity, but it's actually a real hurdle that companies have to cross. And chasm two holds the key to commercial success. Now, unlike popular perceptions about how the growth of a company in that area is primarily driven by access to capital, our work has shown that there are actually 12 vectors, 12 key levers that a firm can pull in order to expedite crossing chasm two. The 12 vectors can be divided into three groups. There are 4 external vectors, which are really shaped by the market environment. And so I had some questions this morning about how much Brexit might affect the market environment. And I was pointing out that Brexit was just one example of how a market environment can be shaped. So the first vector is the market space you're in. The second vector is the competitive and regulatory environment around that market space. The third is defining customers clearly, so customer clarity. Are you selling to a consumer? Are you selling to a big business, to a small business? And then the fourth vector is to do with distribution and marketing and selling. How you build networks to distribute your products, your services. So those are the 4 external vectors. And those actually matter a huge amount, probably much more so than money does. The internal vectors, there are 6 of them, and money is only one of them. Investment, financial capital is the first. The second one, which everybody understands, is actually about human capital. But you can unpack that not just in terms of talent, but also leadership, organizational structures, cultures inside organizations, how people are remunerated, how they're motivated. And then the other internal vectors, for engineering in particular, how technology is deployed. So what is the way in which a technology idea gets taken to market? So technology deployment is one. The next one after that is how is that being packaged up into a product or service proposition? So how do we synthesize a product, which is different from having a scientific idea, because it's all about wrapping everything around it in order to provide something that a customer wants. Then we have intellectual property, which is pretty critical in terms of protecting, differentiating your position in terms of what you do. And then there's manufacturing and assembly, which is of course something engineers know a great deal about. So my point in the talk was engineers in particular, engineering companies, understand some of those vectors, but don't give them enough credence. And then of course those 4 external vectors and the 6 internal vectors, in reality, the way that they shape the growth of a firm is influenced by 2 composite vectors. One is the commercialization strategy. So the strategy basically says, what are my choices about picking those vectors which matter for what I want to do? Can I throw more money at the problem, or do I throw less money and more technology, or do I focus on the people? So that's the commercialization strategy is a key composite vector, and that's a qualitative vector. It's decisions made by management, etc. But then that gets translated into money through the business model, which is how is money earned, how costs are incurred, how margins work. And people think business models are all about spreadsheets. Well, they're not. It's actually about the narrative, your story about the architecture for how you're going to earn money. So if I take a popular example today of Uber, Uber has a business model which says that lots and lots of individuals pay money to people who are not employed by Uber. So the costs aren't on Uber's books. So that's what I mean about an architecture, and understanding that architecture is critical to business success. So the reason I was speaking this morning is because we now have a much better handle on the journey. We understand the levers that we can pull in order to bring about a change. But the point, of course, is not to understand the world, but to bring about a transformation. And so we think there are transformations at three different levels. Level one is at the level of national governments, stuff that happens at what economists would call the macroeconomic layer. Policy set by the Chancellor about how much money can go into an industry or not, allocation of resources at a national level. At the other end of the spectrum, of course, is what private firms themselves are doing. How much firms are choosing to invest, how they're growing, what their aspirations are, and that private sector has always been very good at trying to drive it. The problem, of course, comes is that the layer in between, the mesoeconomic layer, is where all the confusion and the challenges now are emerging, because the macroeconomic theory says governments don't intervene except when there's a market failure. And of course we know that other governments don't play the game by the same rules in other parts of the world. And so we're at a disadvantage if we don't do something about it. But rather than talk about how many things we can do at a macro level, we need to understand stuff at that meso layer. And the meso layer involves regional development, understanding market sectors, so understanding, for example, the strength of engineering sector companies, say in the Birmingham area, or understanding aerospace in Lancashire, or understanding digital media in London, and being able to design interventions. And so part of my talk today was part of a tour that I've been going around with my colleagues over the last few months, trying to get people to think about how we can influence national industrial strategy. And what we're hoping is that the government's white paper, when it emerges in the autumn or early next year, will start to address some of these challenges so that intervention agencies like Innovate UK and others will start to pay more attention to scale up rather than just the startups.